In the last video, we loaded the transcription from a file so that when we refresh this app, it loads immediately instead of having to send the audio from this video to a backend and have it be transcribed by a speech-to-text model and have to wait until that transcription is available in order for us to work with this application. And in this video, we're going to add this detect silences button so that it creates regions where it finds silences in the speech that exceed a threshold that we can set here. All right, let's get started. We'll start by starting up the application, and for that I'll go into the README so that I can see the commands that I need to in order to start up the application. So this is just setting it up, but if I want to run it, if I already have it set up, then I run these commands. This is for the backend. So first I have to be in that server, in that directory that has my virtual environment. Then I need to activate my virtual environment. Once it's activated, then I can run that command. Okay, the backend has started up and it's loaded the WhisperX model. So now I can start up the front end. With that, just have to make sure that I'm in the video editor app directory, and then I can run npm start. That brings up my application, so I just go to the edit page. So now that we're in the edit page, I want to add a button right here to detect silences. And we're going to use the transcription to find those silences based on the word gaps. So right now we have this transcription loaded up as a file, and I never confirmed that it did have word gaps and that WhisperX created precise word gaps that cut off at the end of the word instead of including a long silence after the word. So let's go into that transcription file. Okay, now that I have it open, I can see that even within the first word gap, or the first two words, there is a gap. You can see the end time of all and the beginning of right. It's very small, it's only 20 milliseconds, but it's there. So if we're working with a phrase that has a bigger gap, like for example, at the end of anniversary and the beginning of it's, there's a word gap of like 550 milliseconds. So we can work with that. And that corresponds to, we can't see it on the screen. Let me see if I zoom in. This word gap right here, I believe. So that's roughly 550 milliseconds. So a word gap like this one could be closer to a second, and then we'd be able to detect it with the detect silences button. All right, so let's tell Cursor what to do. This transcription is loaded into the video editor context state. And by looking at this file, the transcription file, we can see the format of the transcription. So we have the full text here, and then we have the segments, and each segment represents a phrase. For example, right here, the phrase is, it's got all the upgrades you could want. And then within that segment, we have the start time and end time of that segment, and also the individual word level timestamps. So the word it has its own timestamp here, the start and end time of that word, along with how confident the model was that this was the correct word from the audio, and so on. So with that, we can prompt Cursor and tell it the format of the transcription. The video editor context has a transcription state with the following format. So let me collapse this and just copy over this into a separate file because I want to edit it. And I don't need to include the actual text. I can actually just say it's a string, it doesn't even matter. And then same with the language. I don't even need these attributes actually, so I'll just delete them. The only one I care about is the segments because that's the only one I need to make Cursor aware of. So I can just, since I'm going to tell Cursor the format, I don't need to keep every entry. I just need to tell it it's a list of dictionaries. And then within these dictionaries, I have ID, text, start time, end time, and then the words is another list. And then that list is a list of dictionaries. And again, I only need one entry to show it the format. So I can just say, I'll include only the first entry and then the actual text doesn't matter. It's just, I'm just going to tell it that it's a string. Same with the text here of the segment. Now with that, I can provide this to cursor. This is just to reduce the context, and then so that cursor doesn't get confused with the text inside of the transcription, inside of the text here. Okay, so the format is pasted. Instead of saying with the following format, I'm going to say with the format below. Because when you say with the following format, it expects it to be the next line. I don't need this file anymore, so let me close that. And then now I can continue with the rest of the prompt. I would like to add a button to the video playback controls that is called detect silences. Actually, I should have explained a little bit before that. So after this first sentence, I want to explain the transcription is a dictionary containing multiple attributes. The one I care about is the segments attribute. It contains a list of dictionaries, and each item contains more attributes, including words, where words is another list of dictionaries. And each item in the words dictionary is a word level timestamp. It contains the word that was transcribed, the start time, the end time of that spoken word. The word timestamps have clear cutoff points between the subsequent words. The gap between the end time of one word and the start time of the subsequent word can be considered silence. And then I can proceed with the rest of my prompt. I would like to add a button to the video playback controls that is called detect silences. When a user clicks on this button, it will look at the transcription state and find the corresponding gaps in the words from the transcription. It should only detect gaps exceeding 0.8 seconds, but it should allow the user to configure this within the playback controls. Please implement this logic into my code. Okay, let's see. I'm wondering if that's clear enough. That last part, please implement this logic into my code, isn't very clear, so let me think if there's any way I could make it more clear exactly how I want it. Well, I think that should be good. So let me just add the pages that I need as context, the video editor context, and the playback controls. And actually, I forgot the most important part. What is it going to do once it detects those silences, those word gaps? So before I end the prompt with please implement this logic into my code, I'm going to add more. The list of word gaps will be used to set the trim history state. It should not overwrite the trim history, it should just add to it. Whenever the trim history is set, it creates audio waveform segments on the WaveSurfer object. But this logic is already set. And then I'll end the prompt with, please implement the logic to detect these word gaps and create a list of word gaps that are used to set the trim history state. So I can delete the previous ending statement. And with that, I'll add the WaveSurfer audio waveform component just in case it needs that context, but I think that should be good. I'm going to prompt it with Gemini just because it's so fast and it's pretty accurate. Sometimes it doesn't like to execute tool calls, so it won't make changes to your files. And I haven't been able to figure out when it refuses to make changes and when it just provides a list of suggestions. So let's see if we can get it to make changes to our files. So I'll hit submit. It's thinking, it's coming up with a plan, and then it says it's going to modify this file. So hopefully it actually does it. It does say it's generating, so hopefully it is working. And it has started to make changes, so that's good. And it's continuing on with the next file, I think. So I'll just give it some time to finish running, and then we'll review everything that it did. Okay, so it just finished running, And before I review the statements and the code, I want to go back into my app to see if it's actually working. So I can see that this number here is configurable, so let me just set it to 0.6 seconds and then hit the detect silences button and let's see what happens. Nothing. Let's check the console. It says it detected 16 silence gaps that exceed or equal 0.6 seconds. It even says that it created regions. So I can see that it created this region at 3.6 seconds and it ended at 4.2. So that's roughly 0.6 seconds. It's actually a little bit under. I mean, what about the next one? At 9.5 roughly to 10.8. So that's definitely a big word gap. I wonder if these are the ones that I created earlier because I don't see them here. So let me just refresh and then let me check the console. There's nothing there right now. So I will make this 0.6 seconds again, have the console open, and then actually I can't see the button. So let me hit detect silences here, go into the console, and it did find the gaps, but it doesn't look like it set the trim history state. So I want to know if the trim history state was actually set. And I'm sure there's some kind of tool or library to be able to see the state values of the React app within the browser. So I'm going to ask Perplexity. I'm building a React.js application and I would like to be able to see the state values of my app as I interact with it. Is there a tool or library that I can use to do this? Hit submit. So I got a response and the first one listed is the React Developer Tools. I guess that's still the default one. It's been a while since I've used React and that's what I used to use, but that was many years ago. I thought that it might have been replaced by something else. And then it also mentions Redux DevTools. I used to use that one too. And then a few other libraries. And in summary, it says, for most React apps, start with the React Developer Tools extension. It's easy to install, works out of the box, and gives you real-time visibility into your componentry and state. And then it says if you use Redux, add Redux DevTools for advanced state inspection and time travel debugging. Maybe I should add that one too. But I'm not using Redux right now. And then for visual learners or more complex apps, tools like React Site or Realize can provide additional insight into your app structure and state flow. So I'll just stick with React Developer Tools, and then I'll go into the source that it mentions. It brought up this Stack Overflow message, and it was from 7 years ago. But I guess this still works. So let me go into the top answer. And the top answer, when is it from? It was answered in October of 2019 and then edited in July of 2020. So between these tools, I'm going to go with React Site. Here's the GitHub. How do I install it? So for setup, it says make sure you've added React DevTools to Chrome. So let me open that up. Let me add to Chrome, add extension. So it looks like that extension has been added. And then I go back to the setup, and then it says install React Site from the Chrome Web Store. So I'll click on that. It says item not available. So let me search it. React Site. Still can't find it. React Site, Chrome Web Store. Okay, I found the page here. Get started. Okay, in order to get started, it says that React Site requires React DevTools, which we just added. If you don't have Chrome, then download it just so that you can debug your app. You don't have to use it for anything else, but you can use it to load up your application and then debug using these tools. So let me try to install React Site from the Chrome Web Store by clicking this link, and still it doesn't find it. That's weird that even on the website here, it's navigating to a link that doesn't work. If I go back to the GitHub, and there's a setup for Firefox too. I guess you can use Firefox if you don't want to use Chrome. But if I click on React Site here from the Firefox add-ons, then it also errors out. I wonder if this library is no longer being maintained. And yeah, it looks like the last update was 5 years ago, so this is probably no longer relevant. Alright, that's okay. I'll just stick with React DevTools. Okay, so I have my React extension up here. If I click on it, it says this page doesn't appear to be using React. If this seems wrong, follow the troubleshooting instructions. So I click on that. And here I see if you are running your app from a local file, don't forget to check allow access to file URLs on the Chrome extension settings page. Go to settings, extensions, and then toggle that on. Actually, all I had to do was refresh this page, and now I can see that this button has changed, and it recognizes that this is a development build of React. But if I want to see my React developer tools, then I can just go open the developer tools, and the components and profiler tabs will appear on the right. So let me bring up the developer tools, and then I can see that profiles here, profiler, and the components is also here. Okay, so now that I refresh my app, I can see the components here. And it's my context provider that has the state of my trim history, and if I look into the values, then I can see that trim history has no values. Let me try to click on the detect silences again. Let's see if this trim history changes. Detect silences. There's a trim history right here. So I can see that the trim history does have elements, and it has a color, end time, and a start time here, ID and timestamp. I'm not sure if this is the right format for the trim history. Let me refresh the app and add items to the trim history by selecting regions. So if I click on this, let me see, there's no trim history yet because I haven't clicked the trim selected. But let me just have this context provider open, go to value, and then trim history is empty right now, but if I click trim selected, it does add it, and I can see that the values it has is end, start, timestamp, and ID. So the detect silences is adding more info than I need, but at least it does have the end and start. Let me see if I add another one, trim selected. Okay, so now there's 3 items. Let me look into the first one. So this is the first one, starts at 27. Let's see if I click around. So that's roughly here, right? That's the one that we had created at first. And then the next one ends. It looks like it looks like it just created 2. These are identical. So we need to handle duplicate entries into the trim history because right now it's just duplicating them. What if I drag this? I guess it drags both of them. But it didn't update the trim history state. It should. If I move this around, if I go into the console, you can see region is updated. And this region updated contains the right values. The end time is 48. That's about here, right? Yeah, 49. So that region updated is logging the correct end time and start time for this region that I moved, but it's not being updated in the trim history. You can see that the trim history still has the old values. So anytime I move this, it should also update the trim history. Because if I move this, that trim history, if it's not being updated, then when I have the feature to export my video, it'll cut out the wrong segment, right? Because say I were to select this region here, and this is what I want to trim out, but then later on I decide I need to adjust this, so maybe I make it more narrow, and then I say this is the region I want to trim out. When I go and export my final video, these won't be the regions that it trims out of my video. It'll be the regions that were created from the beginning, right? Because it didn't update the trim history. And I can actually see that now because I added this third region, there's 6 elements. The first 2 are still the same. It belongs to the first one that I had created. And then I'm not sure where this one comes from. 51. So that, I guess that belongs to this one. Anyways, there's some issues with the trim history right now, so I'll need to fix that. But obviously, the trim history isn't being synced with the selected regions, because otherwise, as I move this around, it would update the trim history. So that's a bug that we just discovered and we'll need to address. But for now, we need to see why when I click on detect silences, so let me refresh the app. Let me just leave the default 0.8 seconds, click detect silences, go into the video editor context. Okay, I can actually see the state here. So it looks like this might be this is the state of the trim history. Does it not name them? I know that this is the trim history just because I'm familiar with it, but how would I know otherwise? It doesn't name all these values that I have. I wonder if that's something I have to configure for the reactive tools. Let me click into the context provider. That one showed me the actual values and their names. So let me scroll down to the trim history. Here it is. I have all these regions created. So it looks like our code, at least what we prompted cursor with, is working, because the video editor context has this function here, detect silences, and this is being run whenever I click on the playback controls. It added an input field here. This is where you can define the silence threshold, and then it has this button here for detecting silences. When a user clicks on it, it runs this function, handle detect silences, which is up here. It takes the threshold value and then it passes it into this detect silences function, which is the one that we're importing from the video editor context. So going back to the video editor context, this function is running, and within this function, where do we have the set trim history? So here it is. So right after it logs detected X number of silence gaps exceeding the threshold, which we did see in the console here, detected 9 silence gaps exceeding 0.8 seconds, it sets the trim history. Okay, so I think our code is working, at least what we prompted cursor with, but there's just a bug with our audio waveform component not updating whenever the trim history is updated. Okay, so since our code is working, the code that cursor generated, let's just review the changes that I made. We'll commit them, and then we'll debug the audio waveform component. Okay, so after I prompted it, it says that it understands the requirements. It needs to enhance the video editor context to handle silence detection based on the word timestamps and the transcription data, and then add the controls into the playback controls to trigger this detection and configure the threshold. So as we saw this, it did work correctly. It did add the detect silences button to the playback controls, and then it did update the video editor context with functions to update the trim history, but let's continue reading. So in the video editor context, it says it created a state for the threshold, and it's called silence threshold, and then it has its setter function. It's called set silence threshold, and it defaults to 0.8 seconds. If we scroll in the video editor context, we can see that defined up here. So I'll accept that. And then for the next change, it says it implemented a detect silences function. So let's search for that. Here it is. And it says this function will iterate through the transcription's words, calculate gaps between consecutive words, both within and between segments. Oh, that's awesome. Because if we look at the transcription, you can see that each segment, for example, this one right here, that has the phrase, it's got all the upgrades you could want. It has the individual word level timestamps, right? And it can easily detect the time gaps between the words within a segment. So the gap between this word here, the end of it, and the start of the next one. But it can also detect the gaps between the last word in this segment being 5.575 seconds and the start of the first word in the next segment, which is this word here, tires, and it's 5.915 seconds. I'm glad it figured out how to parse the transcription JSON, because it recognized that it needed to be able to detect the gaps between consecutive words, even if they were in different segments. And so it identified the gaps exceeding the silence threshold, which we defaulted it to 0.8 seconds. And so with that, this detect silences function will generate region objects for these gaps. and it'll include the start, end, and a unique ID. And these objects will be appended to the existing trim history. So that does work because when I click on detect silences, it did update the trim history, as we can see here. So that part is working. Let's go back to the video editor context file. The last thing that it did in that file is it exposes the new state and function through the context provider's value. Yeah, we can see that down here. It just adds these to expose them to its children. So I'll accept that one as well. So far this was just part of the plan. So let me scroll down to the bottom, because sometimes it'll come up with a plan, make changes to certain files, and then it recognizes that it needs to make more changes. So it'll go back to a file that it previously worked on and then make more updates. Okay, here we're in the middle of the cursor response, and after it's made all those changes to the video editor context file, it says, I've updated the video editor context to include the silence threshold state and the detect silences function, just like it said it would. And it just says, this function calculates gaps between words, including intersegment gaps, and adds any gaps longer than the specified threshold to the trim history. And lastly, the detected silence regions are given an orange color to distinguish them visually. Oh, that's nice. I didn't even prompt it to do that, but that'll look nice once we get it to work in the audio waveform. And it looks like these were all changes that it made within the video editor context. Let's continue. Here it's going to make changes to the playback controls. Those we already reviewed. It wasn't a ton. And then it summarizes what it changed in the playback controls. And then it gives an outline for how to test the application. Okay, so it doesn't say anything else about what it did to the video editor context, so let's review the code itself. So when this detect silences function is executed, first thing it does is make sure that there's a transcription, that it has segments, and that that segments list or array has a length, so that meaning that there are segments from the transcription. Otherwise, if it doesn't find either of these, then it returns nothing, an empty list, because it's not going to be able to find anything. And then it proceeds to create a detected silences list and a last word end time. It's just initializing that variable there. And so it goes into the transcription JSON and it iterates through each segment. Let's look at the transcription JSON. So it iterates through each item in this segment list. This right here is one item of the segment list. And then if it doesn't find words in that segment, then it just returns nothing. Basically skips the segment for gap calculation. And I'm gonna just accept this block here so that it's easier to read the text, because the contrast may make it difficult to read this text. So as long as it does find words in this segment, then it proceeds to check the gap between the last word of the previous segment and the first word of the current segment. Here it's just doing some fancy index calculation, so it's just getting the previous segment, checking that that previous segment has words, getting the last word of the previous segment, getting the first word of the current segment, so that it can calculate the intersegment gap. And then if that intersegment gap exceeds the threshold, then it knows it found the silence, and then it adds that silence into the detected silences array. And this is all the info that it is adding to that array. So some of these we don't need, but we'll leave them in there for now. And so this is executing whenever it's not working on the first segment. If it is working on the first segment, then it has this else block here where there's no code, but it does have a comment that here I can check for the gap from the video start to the first word. So if I wanted to do that so I can remove silences from the beginning, then I can do that, but I'll implement that later. For now, let's just continue. Okay, so that's interesting. First, it detected the silences between segments, and now it's going to detect the silences within the segments, because we're still in this loop here where we're iterating through each segment. So let's go down here. We're within one segment, and then we're going to loop through each word. And just like we did before with segments, we're going to do some index calculation to figure out what the next word is, figure out what the gap is between the next word and the current end time of the end time of the current word. And then if that gap exceeds the threshold, then it adds that silence to the detected silences array. And then it sets the last word end time to the end time of the current word. That way, when it goes into the next word, it can use this value to figure out if there's a gap. And then what else does it do? I think we're done iterating through the segments. If I collapse this iteration here where it's iterating through the segments, yeah, this is the next part. So in this little block here, we looped through the segments, calculated the gaps in between segments and then within the segments as well. And so we've reached the end of the last segment, and then there's this code block here. If I want to detect the gap from the very last word of the segment to the end of the video, and this is optional. For now, I'll leave it commented because I can just prompt cursor to uncomment these sections once I do need them, but for now I'll leave them. And then to finish off, as long as it does find silences, then it's going to add them to the trim history using this function. And here it's just making sure that it doesn't overwrite what was already in the trim history, and it's just appending these new silence segments. And then it returns those detected silences that it was creating in this function. All right, so this detected silences function, it does use a callback. So as we saw in previous videos, this callback makes it so that the function is memoized. So as long as the threshold hasn't changed, as long as the transcription hasn't changed or the set trim history updater function hasn't changed, then this won't need to be recalculated during each render. And that means that any other hook that's listening for changes to this function won't be updated because this isn't changing. All right, so that does look good, and I already accepted it. So everything in this file we approve of. So let me just stage this file. And the playback controls, we already reviewed it. It was pretty simple, but let's just open up the summary. Let's look at the plan that I had for the playback controls. It says it's going to add a local state to manage the threshold input value. And here's that local state, local silence threshold. And as its initial value, it uses this value called default silence threshold, which it gets from the video editor context. So that state is just local, so I'll accept that one. And then it includes an input field of type number, allowing the user to enter the desired silence duration threshold. And that's down here. This is the input here. The next thing it added was the button, detect silences button, so that's down here as well. So I will accept that. All it did here was update the name of the trim button, and I won't accept that just because I prefer trim over trim selected. And then lastly, it created an event handler for the button that calls the detect silences function from the context, passing the user-defined threshold. And that's this one here. If threshold isn't a number or the threshold is less than 0, then it throws an alert to the user so that they can correct that. And then as long as that is a number exceeding 0, then it passes it into the detect silences function from the video editor context. So I will accept that one. And here it's just importing those updater functions from the video editor context, so that looks good too. And I will stage that file. We don't need to read the summary because this was pretty simple code, but here's the testing procedure if you. So just to review what it says to do in order to test the application. First, you want to load the application and ensure that the default video and transcription load. Yeah, those load without problem. Here's the transcription, here's the video. Observe the waveform. Initially, there should be no orange silence regions. Locate the silence threshold input field and the detect silences button in the playback controls. That's here, the silence threshold and the detect silences. Keep the default threshold and click detect silences. Check the browser's console for logs indicating how many silences were detected. Observe the waveform again, and it says that orange regions should now appear, marking the detected silences. And obviously that's not true, and it's not because of anything Cursor did wrong in this implementation. There's a bug in our code from before, so we just need to correct that. And then it says try changing the threshold value and click detect silences again, and just verify that the regions are created. All right, so that looks good. There's changes that I didn't stage. Oh yeah, this one. So I'll just make sure to stage that one as well. And now I'm ready to commit these changes. So I'll pull up my document where I have the commit message, and I call it commit1. This document basically just tells it to look at the stage changes. You can use the conversation thread to understand any changes that are made, and then commit these changes according to the format below. Here, I'll make it bigger so you can see. This is the same that we were using from before, from previous videos, but just in case you're joining us for the first time, that's what this does. So I'll just tell it, I don't need any of these as context. I can just prompt it with, please follow these instructions carefully. I noticed that even if I have clear instructions in this document, when I add it, just adding the file down here with no other prompt, sometimes it doesn't listen carefully. It sometimes doesn't run this function here to look at the stage changes, or sometimes it doesn't commit the message itself. So I just have to prepend it with this statement here. Please follow these instructions carefully. But with that, I can submit it, and I'm actually going to ask Claude because it's better at executing tool calls. I'll hit submit. All right, so I did look at the stage changes, and then I wrote this commit message and it committed it. You can look at the commit message here, but it just summarizes everything that we did. But you can see that if we want to take a look, make sure that this was committed, then I can just pull up the terminal, run this command, git log one line, and you can see that the last commit includes this add silence detection feature. Okay, to finalize these changes, we just need to make sure that we debug what's going on with the audio waveform. So let me pull up the audio waveform component and see if I can identify, by looking at the code, why it's not updating regions when the trim history changes. So I can see here that this effect hook in the audio waveform is listening to the trim history, but there's no other hook that listens to the history, and this one is not actually creating regions based on what's in the trim history. All it's doing is it's getting the regions that have already been created here. So these are regions that I just created, and then it gets those regions out from the plugin, and then it checks those regions against the trim history and makes sure that they match with what's already in the trim history. Because when I click on trim here, this trim button executes a function that adds these regions, right, to the trim history, but they're not connected. If we look at this button and the code that runs, let me just pull up the playback controls so we can see the handler, and we can look at the button for trim here. It has this on-click event handler called handle trim, which is up here, and this handle trim function executes this other function called add trims to history from the video editor context. So let me pull up that one and search for add trims to history. It's down here, and what it's doing is it's pulling the regions that have already been created in the audio waveform, and using those regions it creates a trim history list, and it sets the trim history. So basically I have to manually create these regions, right? So if I refresh, I'm creating a region here, a region here, and a region here. And so now whenever I get the regions from my audio waveform, I can get them in this way. And when I click on this trim button, it's executing this function that gets those regions that I manually created. And those regions are what's used to create the trim history. But there's nothing working in the other direction where it actually creates those regions. So I need to add some functionality so that whenever the trim history is updated, it creates those regions in the audio waveform. And that's what I need to prompt cursor with. Let me pull up a new chat. I'll start with no context for now, and I'll add it as I come up with the prompt. So let me prompt it with, when I manually create regions in the audio waveform, I can click on a button called trim, and it will extract those manually created regions from the audio waveform in order to set the trim history. The audio waveform component has an effect hook to listen to changes to the trim history, and all it does is confirm that the manually created regions are in the trim history, which were set when I clicked on the trim button. I need to add an effect hook into my audio waveform component that creates regions on the audio waveform based on what is in the trim history, so that when I click on the Detect Silences button from my playback controls and it executes a function that updates the trim history, these new items in the trim history will have corresponding regions in the audio waveform that the audio waveform effect hook automatically creates. Okay, that looks good, so I'll prompt it with that. And I forgot to give it context, so it did search through my codebase for audio waveform component, and then it found the file that it needed that I should have provided as context, but I just forgot. And then it made some changes. Let's go into the app to see if those changes worked. So let me click on Detect Silences, and nothing. Let me look at the state of the video editor context to make sure that those trim history are there. So go into the context provider, look at the values, trim history, there's nothing there. Let me try again. Detect silences clicked. So it's here, but there's no regions that were created. So let's look at what happened. Let's look at what it says to see if we can identify why it didn't work. So let me open up the audio waveform file and read what cursor responded with. Based on the information gathered, I need to add a new effect hook in the audio waveform component that creates regions based on the items in the trim history. So make some changes to the audio waveform. And then it says, let's add a check for WaveSurfer readiness in the new effect hook to ensure we only create regions when the WaveSurfer instance is fully initialized. So that's what this line here does. Actually, it's this block right here. It's going to check that the WaveSurfer is ready, because if it's not, then it's going to execute this. Basically, it creates this handle ready function that is executed once the WaveSurfer object is ready. And this handle ready function, it executes this handle trim history change function down here. So this is what's running if WaveSurfer wasn't ready, and then it just returns, so the rest doesn't run. But if this doesn't run because the WaveSurfer was ready, then it just does the same thing. It runs this handle trim history change. So this is where all of the logic for handling the trim history is. So next line in the explanation. Now let's verify that our changes won't conflict with the existing functionality. We need to make sure the other effect hook that updates region colors will still work properly with our new effect hook. Let's continue reading. And so as it's updating the file, the audio waveform file, it can sometimes notice things, and here it has a note. The changes look good, but I noticed that we have two separate effect hooks that run on the same dependency array, the trim history. Let's optimize this by combining them into a single effect. So just updating the code so that now they're all into one effect hook, which is this one right here. You could see that this was the code that I had before. If I collapse this, now I only have one effect hook that's listening to trim history, because it combined the logic from what it had before to what it implemented here in this new change. So let's look at the summary of changes. Added a new effect hook to create regions in the audio waveform based on what's in the trim history. Added some error handling, added proper checks for WaveSurfer readiness, combined the two separate effect hooks, and made sure the color information from the trim history is preserved. So without looking at the code, it did seem that it understood what we needed it to do, but for some reason it's still not working. So let's look at the code, and we can see that this function has all of the logic for handling changes to the trim history state. So let's look at it. So it starts out by first getting the regions from the plugin, creating a set of the IDs of those regions that were already there. And then it's going to loop through the trim history. And for each item in that trim history, it's going to make sure that that item doesn't already have a corresponding region in the regions plugin. So if it doesn't have a corresponding region, then it's going to create one with these details here, and then it's going to add that region, and it should log this line here, created region for trim history item. But if I look at the app, I already ran it, right? So we can see that the trim history is there. If I go into the console, I don't see that log anywhere. So somehow this part isn't running. So I'm guessing that this function isn't being called at all. To test that, what I'll do is I'll just add a console message here with the name of the function. So let me refresh the app. Let me click on detect silences. And yep, that line was not logged. So this isn't ever being called. And I'm wondering if it has to do with these event listeners, because this whole block should have been called. Let me just accept this because I reviewed the code. It looks good. This block here should run calling this handle trim history change function anytime the trim history is updated. And it did detect those silences, so that does mean the trim history was updated. But for some reason, this isn't running. So I'm thinking that there's a gap in Cursor's knowledge of this library, the Wavesurfer library, which in turn means this regions plugin. I'm thinking these event handlers, where did they go? These up here may not actually be correct. So let me add some more log statements and say, I'll just accept what it's automatically creating for me. So this is just going to show that the Wavesurfer is not ready because it's going to show the state there. But let me just move this one up here. Accept, accept. Actually, let me just accept everything that Cursor implemented. So I removed this line and it updated it with this comment: handle trim history changes, create new regions, and update existing ones. That looks good. Is there anything else? Are there any other files? Nope, that's the only one. So I'll stage that. And then we'll have to prompt Cursor again to fix any misunderstandings it has in the library. Let me go down to the console logs that I was adding down here. It's going to log the Wavesurfer readiness. And if it's ready, it's going to call this handle ready. And the first thing this handle ready does is call this function, which has this log down here. So as long as handle ready is running, then this should be logged. So we already know that handle ready isn't being run. So let me go back to my app. I want to see if this log is running, just to make sure that this effect hook is actually working, which it's going to be because all it's doing is listening for changes to the trim history. But let me just confirm. Refresh, hit detect silences, and we can see that Wavesurfer current is ready. It's undefined. So there's our issue. This doesn't seem to be a method of this Wavesurfer object. Or is it? Let me try to just log this. Let me refresh. Click detect silences. Here's the element. So it is present. I don't see an isReady method. Let's look at the listeners. Audio process, interaction, ready, and time update. So the ready event does happen, but I think the reason this isn't working is because I just needed to remove that. So let me refresh. Let me click detect silences, and awesome, that fixed it. We can see that these are all the silences it detected. Obviously there's some sound here. Let me just listen to what it is.
To see how much you have been.
Okay, so this right here is the word how, but for some reason it detected a silence gap. So let me go into the transcription. Let me search how, and this is the correct word in this phrase here. So let me scroll down to how. Here it is. So this word is clearly in the list of word level timestamps, but it detected it as a silence. The other ones look okay. There's something being said right here, and then this one right here looks like could be some background noise. Let me play it.
That's beautiful.
So this one's just some background noise, so that's good. There's no word that's being cut off here. And I'm guessing that's the case probably for these other ones as well. Yeah, this is just the sound of this door opening, so that's good. But why did it cut out this one? And then it cut out this whole beginning part actually. Let me try running this again. So I'll refresh the app, and then let me zoom in. Let me zoom out actually, so I can see it all. And then I'll leave the default 0.8 seconds to text silences. And again, it's cutting out that same word. Everything else looks good. It cuts out this whole beginning region. So I'm guessing this has to do with the previous commit where it's calculating the silent region in the beginning. Where was that? I think that was in the video editor context. Okay, I found it. It's in this detect silences function, and this code here for the gap from the very last word to the beginning to the end of the video is not running. But let me uncomment it to see what happens. Oh, actually it's not valid code because here it's not actually doing anything. Although all that it should be doing here is the same thing that we were doing before. So let me just copy it from a previous segment, because if this is just adding that gap to the detected silences, which is this right here, I think I should just be able to copy this, because this would be the same logic as up here, right? I think the only thing I have to change is the ID here, and then the start and end. So I'll paste it here. Let me tab that over. And then the ID should be last word end here. And then there's no next word because we're at the last word, so it should be duration. Do I already have duration defined somewhere? Yes. So duration should be here. And then I need to update the end time to duration and the start time to the last word end time. Okay, I think that should work. So let me refresh, click detect silences, and I'm guessing it worked. I mean, there's no silence. Well, there is some silence, so let me bring this down. 0.3 seconds, detect silences. It didn't find it. I wonder if this is even running at all. Let me just add a console log. So I'll add that console log, refresh, and then set the detect silences to 0.2 seconds, detect, and then let's look at the console logs. I see a ton of regions created, but I don't see transcription.segments anywhere. So why isn't this running? Let me add a log before this. I want to see the values of the transcription segment and the duration. So that looks good. Let me refresh. And then detect silences. Probably need to set this down to 0.3. I'm looking through the logs. Okay, so I found the log here. It has the segments here, and then the duration is 0. That's why. Why is the duration 0? Let me look through the code. Where's the duration being set? Okay, so the duration, let's see. Let's look through all instances of it. Where's it getting the value? Oh, this is the video editor context, so it's exporting it. The duration is up here. It's initialized to 0, and the set duration is what updates its value. It's not being updated within here, so it must be updated outside. Let me search the entire code base. Audio waveform. So it's being used in the audio waveform here. It looks like it's not being WaveSurfer current on ready. WaveSurfer is ready. And here is where it should set the duration. So WaveSurfer is ready. That's this log here. If the video reference is available, then it should set the duration. So let me console log here, wave server current. Let me refresh. Wave server is ready. Here's the video. So this should be running down here. Let me undo this. Let me console log video current duration. Refresh. Wave server is ready. The duration is 55. Okay, where else is the duration being set? Down here? Where is this a part of? It's just lower down in the same effect hook that is running anytime the video file changes. So this duration may be updating it. Well, let me go back into my React Dev Tools. Let's look at the context provider, look at the duration value in here. So the duration is here. If I click on detect silences, that duration still is 55 seconds. So why is it that in my video editor context that the duration is 0? Duration, let me fix this log here. So right now I'm within the video editor context inside of the detect silences function, and I just want to log the duration. So let me refresh the app. Let me just go down a little bit, go to the video editor context values. We can see that the duration is 55 seconds here. If I click on detect silences, it didn't find the end one. What did the log say? Let me search the logs for duration, and the duration is still showing that it's 0. So I figured out why. This duration isn't being updated because this effect hook right here, where I have my detect silences function, actually the callback, isn't updating when the duration updates. So if I do that, refresh, let me go down to 0.2 seconds, detect silences, and they found it. That was the problem. It wasn't updating when the duration was changing. So even though the state of the duration was changing, this effect hook, or I mean this callback hook, wasn't updating with the new duration value. Another thing I noticed is there's this big gap right here before whatever this sound is, and then also after. That's definitely exceeding 0.2 seconds, and it's not being detected as a silence. So I'm thinking that whatever this is in the transcription, it wasn't transcribed correctly. Let me play the video from here so I can figure out what this sound is. So this isn't actually a word. The last word spoken was this one. So this right here says same with that one. So let me search in the transcription. Transcription, same with that one. Here's the segment. The segment ends at 51.4 and the next segment begins at 51.424. So according to this transcription, the next segment starts at 51.42 right here, which is only 0.2 seconds away from the last segment. But we can see that that's not true because it's, let me zoom in. It's basically this whole region right here. This is the gap, and it goes from 51 to 54. So the transcription is wrong. This segment, yeah, let me know if you have any questions, doesn't start till roughly right here, which is about 53, 54. And so this is an error in the transcriber. Okay, so we found an error in our transcriber, but we'll figure out why that happened at some point later. And right now we found enough errors. Let me refresh the app. It could be an error because it's the end of the file, or I'm not sure what could have caused it, but basically the transcription is saying that there's words here. Let me now troubleshoot this issue. I'm wondering if it's going to be the same thing, that the transcription that we have doesn't actually start till around 7 seconds. So let me go into the transcription and then go to the top. I can see that this first segment lasts about 3 seconds. Let me look at the next segment. It starts at 4, it ends at 5.5, and then the next one is at 5.9 through 6.9, and then 7 through 9.2. Okay, so the transcription looks like it could be correct right here. We just need to look into the logic of the detect silences function. I have it pulled up, the detect silences here, and let's go to the block that handles the beginning of the segment. So here's the logic for after the first segment, and then this is the logic for the first segment. Potentially check gap from video start to the first word. And here's the logic. So if the first word starts way after the threshold, then it should add some silence. So let me just copy over this logic again. And then for the ID, it should be from 0, because that's the start. It could just be 0 string. And then to the first word start. Same down here, start is just 0. And then end is first word start. That's the end of that silence. So that looks good. Let me refresh the app. It doesn't know what first word is, okay? First word, I didn't uncomment this. So let me refresh the app now. And I can see down here, I don't know if you can see if I'm in the way, but it doesn't look like there's any silence. But I wonder if that gets rid of the issue with this whole region. Nope, it did not. I can see it created multiple regions. 2 for each of the first ones. Is that the case? Yeah, it creates duplicate regions for all of them. Okay, I just refreshed the app, and before I continue debugging, I actually want to stage the changes that I have from my last conversation with Cursor, where I prompted it to automatically create those regions on the audio waveform according to updates in the trim history. So let me just go into the files that were changed. I think it was just the audio waveform. So yeah, it's just the audio waveform. And then I made changes to the video editor context. Let me see what's in staging for, actually, these are changes that I made inside the audio waveform component. So this was the mistake that Cursor had made. It just added this extra is ready method check, but that wasn't needed. So I just fixed that. I'm just going to stage this one. And then these other changes, they're just temporary. They're just meant for me to be able to debug. And I actually already debugged the issue there. So I don't need these. I can discard them. And then inside the video editor context, I'm still making changes here. And these changes that I've made so far have to do with the previous commit, where it detected the silences. If we look at the Git history, right now I have my backend running, but I actually don't need it because all the operations that we're doing on the app, all the interactions, they all have to do with the front end. The only reason we needed the backend was for transcribing the audio, but we're not going to be working with the transcribed, or we're not going to be transcribing the audio while we're making changes to the edit page. So then I don't need to have it running. But if I look at the Git log, we can see that the last commit was for the silence detection feature. So this should have been included. And I actually haven't updated my origin, which is my GitHub repo. So I can actually, let me unstage the audio waveform. I'm going to stage the video editor context, and I'm going to update this commit with the changes here. So this was to fix the gap in the beginning. So if there's any gap in the beginning of the audio, it'll find it here. And then this one was to fix the gap at the end. So if there's a gap between the last word spoken and the end of the video, it'll find it. I'm just going to get rid of these console logs. And then it is listening to the duration. So that looks good. That can be included. Let me stage that. And then I'll do a git commit amend. So it's going to use the same message as before, because all it's doing is updating that commit from before. And in this file, we have the creation of the regions according to the trim history. So we can continue debugging, and any errors that we fix, they'll have to do with the current changes that we're working on. So they'll go into the current commit. Let me detect silences. Obviously these are being created as duplicates, and I'm not sure if it's, okay, you know what, let's just commit these changes. because I'm gonna have to prompt cursor again to create one function that whenever the trim history is updated, it runs that function to make sure that all of these regions that are in the audio waveform are unique. And then maybe I even want to have it check if any of these regions are overlapping, and if they are, then like for example these two regions, or however many there are in there, they overlap right here. So what I wanted to do is recognize that there's an overlap, take the earliest start time and take the latest start time, and then just create one region. So I think that would be a good reason to have a separate commit message. So with that, I will stage these changes, and I'm gonna pull up my cursor thread, and it was in this message right here where I had it automatically create the regions. So within here, I'm going to prompt it with, please follow these instructions carefully. And then I'll attach the commit one. The file is staged, so it should be able to execute. And I'll just let that finish running. Okay, so I just finished making that commit. And we can see here the commit message. The main subject line is, it's recognizing it was a feature to the audio waveform. And the subject line is, add auto region creation from trim history. And then in the body, it says, create regions in the audio waveform automatically when trim history is updated, especially when detecting silences. This ensures visual representation stays in sync with the trim data. And then it just mentions, added some air handling with try check blocks. It checks that the wave surfer element is ready. And then it preserves the color of the created regions. Okay. So I'll end this video here. I know it went a lot longer than I expected it would. So thanks for sticking around. If you like this content, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel to see more like it. Hope to see you in the next one.